The colorful revelation. Democracy or deception? What are color revelations? Across the world, some revelations are violent, some are silent. But in the early 2000s, a new kind of uprising shook Eastern Europe and Soviet Union. They weren't war, they weren't military coup. They were something different, something symbolic, something colorful. They came to be known as the colorful revolutions. Why colorful? Because each movement had a symbol. A rose in Georgia, the color orange in Ukraine, tulip in Kazakhstan, and a bulldozer in Serbia. Symbol powerful enough to unite thousands, sometimes millions of ordinary people. At their heart, colorful revolutions were about one thing: contesting power without violence. They erupted when people started to believe elections were stolen, when corruption ran deep, when democracy was denied. Instead of guns, the protesters carried flowers. Instead of bombs, they carried flags. Instead of bullets, they used the power of numbers. Crowds so large that regions no longer ignored them. Behind the colors, there was a bigger story. The revelations happened in the shadow of the Cold War's end. Western NGOs and foundations poured money, training, and strategy in civil groups. Russia accused West orchestrating regime change on its doorstep. Were revelation really the voice of people? Or were the pieces in global chessboard of power? One thing is certain: they changed the history, they toppled governments, they redrew the alliances, they inspired movement from the Arab Spring to today's protest, and they left us with one haunting question: were the revelation democracy in action or deception in disguise? Serbia, the bulldozer revelation. October 2000, Serbia, a country exhausted by war, sanction, and decade of dictatorship. At the center, Slobodan Milosevic, the man who defeated NATO, crushed the descent, clung to power, but the people had had enough. The final spurt? A stolen election. Milosevic claimed victory, but the people claimed fraud. Students, workers, farmers, even the policemen poured into the streets. Leading them was a youth movement called Otpor. Their weapon? No guns, no bombs, but humor, art, graffiti, and a clenched fist painted on walls across the country. October 5th, 2000, Belgrade exploded. Hundreds of thousands marched on the capital, and then came the bulldozer. A single construction bulldozer smashed into the parliament gate. It became revolutionary icon. The moment the people physically get through the fortress of power. Inside the parliament, flames rose. Outside, chants shook the city. Police forces began to defect. By the nightfall, Milosevic, the strong man who once ruled the Yugoslavia, was finished. He resigned the next day, and the bulldozer changed the history. But this was no ordinary uprising. Behind Otpor were foreign trainers, NGOs, and democracy-promoting organizations. Millions of dollars flowed into Serbia to strengthen civils and plan nonchalant resistance. For the West, it was a victory for democracy. For the Moscow, it was a warning. A new model of regime change had just been tested. It worked. The bulldozer revelation lit a fire across the region. Ukraine, Georgia, Kazakhstan, the government would fall. All without armies, without tanks, just with crowds, colors, and symbols. That's why Serbia 2000 matters. It was a prototype, the blueprint, the first color revelation. Georgia, the Rose Revelation. On November 2003, Georgia, a small nation at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, struggling with corruption, poverty, and promises of democracy. At the top, Edward Shevardnadze, once hailed as a reformer, now accused of fraud, cronyism, and betrayals of people's trust. The spur? Parliamentary election. Allegation of massive fraud triggered outrage. Students, leading opposition, and ordinary citizens flooded the street Tbilisi, leading them a fiery political man named Mikhail Saakashvili. Charismatic, bold, backed by activists and foreign democracy groups. He carried one weapon into the battle, a rose. On November 22, the protesters stormed the parliament. Rose in the hand, chants on their lips, courage in their hearts. They pushed the past police line. They entered the chamber. They forced Shevardnadze to flee the building. Shevardnadze resigned and the old guard was gone. And Georgia Rose Revelation had triumphed without a single shot of fire. But the revelation don't end when the power changes hands. They only begin. But the revelation don't end when the power changes hands. They only begin. Saakashvili became the president, promising to crush corruption, modernize Georgia, and align with the West. For a time, hope soared, but soon cracks appeared. Saakashvili's government launched bold reform, but critics came of growing authoritarian, silencing opposition, and concentrating power in hands. By the end of the decade, many who had carried Rose now carried signs against him. Ukraine, the Orange Revolution. November 2004, Ukraine, a nation divided between East and West, between the Soviet ties and dreams of Europe. At stake, its presidential election. One candidate, Viktor Yanukovych, backed by Moscow, and the other, Viktor Yushchenko, pro-Western, promising to reform. The election would not just change Ukraine, but the balance of global power. When the officials declared Yanukovych the winner, something snapped. A report of massive fraud spread like wildfire, and the Yushchenko bore the scars of sinister plot, poisoned during the campaign, the face permanently disfigured. For millions, this wasn't just politics, it was survival, it was justice. Kiev erupted. Tens of thousands camped in the freezing mud of a square. They wore orange scarves, waved orange banners, lit orange fires. Their revelations of color was unmistakable, and for weeks they refused to leave. The pressure grew, the world watched. The court was forced to act. Ukraine's Supreme Court declared the election was invalid and ordered a new vote. In the rerun, Yushchenko triumphed. The Orange Revolution had won, and the stolen election overturned by the people power. But the revelation bring hope and heartbreak. Soon, the unity of Orange leaders collapsed into infighting. Yushchenko and his ally, Yulia Tymoshenko, turned against each other. Corruption lingered, promises faded. By the 2010, Yanukovych, once the man defeated, was back, elected as president, and the Orange dream began to dim. Yet, the Orange Revolution lived on. It showed the people of Ukraine their strength. But in 2014, when Yanukovych again tried to betray them, this time by turning away from Europe, the Maidan would rise on again. But that is another story. Kyrgyzstan, the Tulip Revolution. March 2005, Kyrgyzstan, a small landlocked nation in Central Asia, often overlooked yet strategically vital. The president Askar Akayev ruled for 15 years. Once called a reformer, now faced the charges of corruption, nepotism, and stolen election. For the people of Kyrgyzstan, patience had run out. The spark parliamentary election. Allegations of fraud ignite protests across the south of the country. Villages and towns rose up. The demonstrations spread like wildfire until they reached the capital. On March 24, Bishkek erupted. Thousands of protesters stormed the government headquarters. Police line collapsed. The crowd poured in, breaking through windows, waving flags and chanting for freedom. By the nightfall, President Akayev fled the country. The government that seemed immovable was gone in a single day. And with it, Kyrgyzstan's Tulip Revolution was born. But the revolution didn't bring stability. Karmanbek Bekiev took the power, promising reform. Instead, corruption deepened, break the promises. By 2010, people rose up again, another revolution. Bekiev overthrown just as Akayev had been. In Kyrgyzstan, revolution became a cycle. 2005, 2010, again and again. Leaders failed, but yet little seemed to change. The Tulip Revolution showed the both power and limits of the people's movement. They could topple rules, but creating a stable democracy proved far harder. Democracy or geopolitical? Were the colorful revolution really about democracy, or they were about power? This is the question that divides the world. In every colorful revelation, Serbia, Georgia, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, one pattern stood out. Protesters erupted over election of being fraudulent. Mass movements filled the streets. Leaders fell. But behind the scene, there were foreign funding, NGOs, and strategic training raised questions. One thing is clear. The color revolution was never just local event. They were battle in a global struggle between people demand with change and power fighting for influence. And the echoes are still with us today. The legacy of colorful revolution. The colorful revolution started with a new era. Peaceful protest, democratic change, a voice of people. But what did they leave behind? First, hope. First, at the moment, it was felt like anything possible. In Serbia, a dictator fell. A corrupt old guard swept away. In Ukraine, a stolen election overturned. In Kyrgyzstan, the people showed us they could force the leaders out. But the revelation are not just about the day after, they're about the years that followed. And here, the story grows darker. Serbia struggled with political divisions. Georgia's Saakashvili became one he opposed. Ukraine's orange leaders turned on each other. Kyrgyzstan fell into a cycle of revolution, instability, and promises break. The lesson: topple the government is easier than building a lasting democracy. Second, the backlash. Russia saw the movement as a threat for its survival. In response, Moscow doubled down, tightening control at home and pushing back abroad. The wars in Georgia 2008, Ukraine in 2014, and again in 2022. They all were shaped by the shadow of the colorful revelation. Third, the inspiration. The tactic of colorful revelation, nonchalant violence, powerful symbol, and the use of media spread the globe. From Arab Spring to Hong Kong's umbrella movement to Belarus and beyond. The dream that ordinary people could challenge the power lived on. So what is legacy of colorful revolution? They showed the world that protest can move mountains without guns, without tanks, and without words. But they also showed us that democracy cannot be imported, but it must be built with slowly, painfully from within. The colorful revelation is not the end of the history. Perhaps it is the beginning of the struggle that continues to this day. Were they democracy in action or geopolitics in disguise? Perhaps they were both. This is the story of colorful revelation, hope, heartbreak, and lesson for tomorrow.